Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first conversation of the 2023 Mimesis Documentary Festival. So we do these conversations around thematic topics and try to bring filmmakers together to use maybe to speak from the perspective of their work on the topic that we are discussing. I've been really fascinated by this idea of witness and documentary's capacity to witness, and even maybe the capacity of documentary subjects to be witnesses, maybe even the capacity of documentaries themselves, right, to be witnessed, right, especially when we're sitting on that side, right, looking up at the screen. So there's this kind of overlapping layering of witnessing that seems to always be going on, and I've been trying to pick it apart in my mind, so maybe you guys can help me have a little bit more clarity on what this might mean and what might be at stake, right, when we engage in witnessing in this kind of way. And I think it's grounded in, at least for me so far, I think it's grounded in experience. So I just have a few notes here that I'm going to go over first, and then we can introduce each other in our work, and maybe start to speak to this and how all of these kind of very diverse works might engage with this idea. So experience, I think, is often used in a very passive way, right? Like things happen to us, but I want to think of it more actively here, like we're doing something when we experience. You know, etymologically, experience is to act out of risk, right? To test something. Experience entails risk, and the risk of documenting, I think, might be the risk of becoming a witness, right, to events, and that the documenting body, as I put in the description of this, is a witnessing body. Right? It's extended in some way, maybe with a camera or an audio recorder, or maybe even extended by an archive, right? A lot of these works maybe are witnessing that is extended by archive. And it made me think of this. There's a poet named Carolyn Forché who talks about documentary poetics, right? Against Forgetting is a great compilation of poetry of witness that she put together. And Forché, Sandra Beasley describes Forché's idea of the poetry of witness as a poetry. The poetry of witness occupies a third realm between the personal, which she calls lyric acts, and the political, which she calls oratorical acts, right? And so there's these two realms of kind of documentary poetics, the personal and the political, but she's arguing there's actually this third, right? And that's the realm of witness, which she calls the realm of the social. So it's not necessarily the personal, it's not necessarily political, but it's the social. And I think we often say, like, the personal is political, right? This is a phrase that we probably all know, we've all heard. And I think that that is true, but my question is, like, how does it get there? How does the personal get to the political? Like, what's the path that it takes? And I'm thinking that that path might be through this third realm, through the realm of the social, right? Through the realm of witness. And so rather than kind of just, you know, say, oh yeah, we get through social to get to the political, maybe we can just stop for a moment in the third realm and like live in its complexity and try to understand like what it is to be in a social world, which, I mean, documentary, I think, is a fundamentally social act in a lot of ways, right? Even though it might be grounded in deeply personal stories, right? As we say in Mimesis mission statement, right? That it's about work that is personal, underrepresented, that offers profound experiences of art made from life, right? But how do we get to it? Maybe it's through the realm of the social. And there's this, there's a quote that I'm going to read from Leibniz's monadology. So Leibniz, 17th century philosopher, right, is trying to pick apart what is essential in the world, what cannot be reduced, what doesn't have composite parts, right? What is just itself for its own sake, rather than itself as a collection of other things, as an assemblage, right? And so he calls these substances simple substances, right, rather than these complex ones. And he also calls them monads, right? And he says, now this is from Proposition 56 in the monadology, where he says, now this interlinkage or accommodation of all created things to each other and of each to all the others brings it about that each simple substance has relations that express all the others, and is in consequence a perpetual living mirror of the universe. And that's where the title of this conversation comes from. This idea of like being a mirror of the universe in some way, that our personal, or what we might think of as our interior experiences, actually transmit, right, through the entire like observable universe in some way, modify, change it, react to it. And to me, that could be the realm of the social, right? This realm of these relations. I think it's quite impressive that he came up with this before the era of quantum physics, right? Because in the 20th century, we have Alfred North Whitehead writing, the ingression of every electron into nature modifies to some extent the character of every event. Thus, the character of the stream of events which we are considering bears marks of the existence of every other electron throughout the universe, right? And so it's almost exactly the same idea in Leibniz expressed as metaphysics, right? As some kind of logical mysticism, we might say. And then in Whitehead, in more scientific terms, right? In terms of the way that we are observing atomic structure. So that these ideas sort of kind of permeate our understanding of the world. I wonder how documentary takes part in that. I'll stop there in this introduction, just to ruminate on some of those ideas. I have a few others that we might get to, probably not, because there's a lot of us here. But in order to make it more clear what's at stake, right, who we're talking to, maybe we could go down the line, just from Paul all the way down, introduce yourselves, your names, and the project that you're bringing, and maybe just 1 or 2 sentences about your project. Yeah, and then we'll move on. I think your mic's on the floor there.
Hello, good morning. Thanks everyone for attending, and thanks to the Mimesis staff and crew for putting this together. It's quite an honor to be here and to be alongside other filmmakers and to enjoy this weekend. And oh, Bentley, hi, you're my roommate. There's my roommate. So we haven't met formally. So my name is Paul Echevarria. My film is Green Before Green. It shows tomorrow, Thursday at 1 p.m. It's basically a film that incorporates 2 channels of witness, if you will. One is footage shot entirely by my son, who at the time was 1.5 to 4 years old prior to the acquisition of language. So that's something that's really key with that footage, is that you're watching footage that's expressive without the benefit or complication of language, if you will, and that he is speaking through visual metaphors and visual images as opposed to spoken text and language structures. And the other part of the film is my own earliest adventures in photography, which were more around the age of 8 to 10 years old, specifically Polaroids. And it incorporates structures and narratives there that are probably a little more, I guess you could say, restrictive, or also channeling in terms of this idea of witness. So one form of witness I would call an uninhibited and perhaps pure form of witness, and the other is once language comes into the fold, how does that affect the output or the structures that we see as it relates to image?
Thanks, Paul.
My name's Devin Narayan Singh. My film is Oceans of Time, which is shown in the shorts program today at 1. I've been thinking about ways to describe my work because I realize I've maybe limited myself in it by only talking about it as a film about addiction. And I think it's a film about the passage of time and the repetitions and the echoes within it that uses addiction and pop music as a nucleus to get to those points.
Thanks, Devin.
Hello, good morning. My name is Carolina, and I'm from Costa Rica. We had the film I bring last night. Maybe you saw it, Rebel Objects. I think I don't have to maybe explain if everybody, but it's like a film that uses archaeology as a metaphor to reflect upon identity, family, memory, And yes, we can speak about other things.
My name's Adrian Randall. My movie's called A Human Year is 7 Earth Years, which plays today at 4. And it's about, sorry, it kind of starts talking about how radio and television in the United States really came directly out of sort of military efforts, and going from there, looking at things like mental health and video art and the information age, and neocolonialism in Central America. So it sort of spins around things a lot.
Thanks, Adrian.
Or you got it.
We have to start with this mic sometime. Hi, I'm Penny McCann. I'm from Ottawa in Canada, and my film Before Me plays tomorrow at 1. So Before Me is a short documentary about my mother's story. So it's intensely personal. My mother was a juvenile delinquent in Bristol, England during the Second World War. And she told me about that. It wasn't a family secret, but she told me about that at the end of her life. And so I went off on a journey to find her in the archives and to see what institutional records can reveal of a person. And towards the end of the process, I come upon a photograph of her, which kind of shapes the whole film. So that's I'll talk more about Witness later.
Hi, I'm Emily Packer. I use she and they pronouns, and I'm here from New York, Lenape land. My film is called Holding Back the Tide, which is a feature that I'll show on Saturday at 4 in Speaking with Tongues. Really excited to share it with this audience, especially given these questions that you've set us up with. The film is about oysters in New York City. It's sort of a city symphony that follows the life cycle of the oyster biologically, but also sort of socio-historically as well. And it's very much engaged in like the present as we consider the future, which I think is maybe where I would want to jump off into talking about Witness.
Hello, everybody. My name is Saif. I'm from Baghdad, and I'm based in California. My film is Bazuna, which is an Iraqi Arabic word for cat. It's playing on Friday at 1. It's about items that immigrants can't bring with them when they leave their homes, or they don't want to bring with them. And it's about a cat and a child who are affected by war. So like both interweaved narratives.
Hi, I'm Morgan Adamson. I'm based in Minneapolis, and I'm really excited to be here. All these films sound amazing. My film is Brutal Utopia, that's playing on Saturday at 1, I believe. And it's about brutalist buildings in Minneapolis that many people call them crack stacks, or they're kind of derided. But I've always found them very beautiful. And so I wanted to dig into the story of them. And what I found was I feel like the buildings themselves have really witnessed some very different ideas about how cities should be organized and how we should think about how utopian ideas about how we can organize society better and whatnot. So the film reflects on that.
Yeah, actually, Morgan, I kind of want to talk about your film
Okay.
first. Am I up? Just because it's, I've full disclosure, I have not seen everybody's movie all the way through, right? I'm not on the programming team. So this is Wednesday of a 6-day festival. So I'm excited to see them all in the theater. But Brutal Utopia is interesting because maybe you wouldn't immediately like think of it as a very personal piece. right? That it's not like me about that so much about someone standing in the world and kind of witnessing events going on and then sharing those events, right, with other people. But I think that it lives in this realm of the social, like very firmly. And I wonder if you could speak to that and maybe like what architecture, right, as objects, but also as kind of social constructs, like how they might witness the passage of time.
Right. That's a really interesting question. Yeah, I think of the buildings almost as kind of characters in the film. Like they start out as kind of heroes, and then they become villains, and then they become these sites of refuge for literally refugees from East Africa. But I really like the way that you spelled out your thinking around witness, and also, Leibniz and Whitehead and all that. And like this kind of, I think of it kind of as a constellation of social forces that come together around ideas about how we should organize social life, right? And these buildings really kind of are in some ways to me like archives of that. Like they themselves archive these ideas and carry them forward, and ideas that we've lost. I think utopian ideals around how to organize cities in any other way that doesn't just foreground profit. And also they've borne witness to waves of migrants or refugees from many countries, but primarily East Africa, who have made them home and who have really turned them into something that they were never intended to be. So I think that the buildings are full of contradictions. And so I was really interested in bringing that out and not really having a central character, but having the buildings themselves be that character. And I guess the only other thing I say is like thinking about witness as a filmmaker. As a white woman, it took me a long time to enter into that space because the population there has been subjected to lots of racism. And HBO is going to make a mini series called Little Mogadishu about ISIS recruitment, about the towers themselves. Like, yeah, so it's like there's like been a lot of scrutiny of the buildings and the population there. And so the end of the film was shot by one of my collaborators who lives there. And I actually never enter into the buildings myself. I'm only ever on the outside as a filmmaker, and it's only my collaborator who goes inside because I just felt like that made more sense to me as a filmmaker, I guess. It wasn't my place, I don't know, to be the witness in that way of what it means to live in the buildings now. So
that's really interesting. So, but you worked with the material.
Yeah. Well, of course,
right?
Yes. Yeah. So I edited it together, and so ultimately I had the final say. But yeah, the footage was all his.
But I think this is an idea that happens in documentary where witnessing gets nested.
Yeah.
Right. And so you kind of witnessed the documentation of a witnessing.
Yeah.
Of witnessing subjects.
Totally.
Right. And this like nesting of witnessing, I think almost like there's a vibration that happens where it becomes more intense. Like it becomes maybe more powerful. And it's making me think of Penny's film, actually. This photograph, like witnessing a document, right, as itself was once taken by that photograph was taken by someone who was witnessing this event, and all the people in the photograph are witnessing this thing happening, and now you're witnessing it like in many times removed. And it brings in a lot of ideas of nostalgia, which we're going to get to, especially in Paul's film. But I wonder if you could speak to the kind of affect that approaching a single document like that might have.
Well, the interesting thing about that photograph is it's a group shot of a bunch of young women who were at this school, and it was just by happenstance that I stumbled upon it because my mother had only been there 3 months, and it was created by the Salvation Army as a maybe not promotional, but as a document of how well that particular it's called an approved school, which was where court ordered delinquents went in England. And so it was meant for, showing how well this particular school was doing to higher ups. So everybody, all the girls, everybody is like looking like they'd rather be somewhere else. And my mother is livid at even being in this situation. And except for the matron who's smiling broadly to everybody. So it's, so it has a particular institutional it's what it's meant to be, so beginning. And for me it's about I mean, when I saw it, I couldn't believe it because I'd never seen my mother so young. I didn't think I was going to see it. Unfortunately, her sister was still alive at the time and was able to, I knew it was her, but I needed to confirm it with somebody who knew her when she was 16. Oh yeah, that's Peggy. And so for me, it was sort of I knew I could place everything around it because it's very, the film is about finding the echoes of a person's life in the archives that lives beyond, facts, and to try to get a sense of to try to find the soul of the person.
Yeah.
And I found the soul of the person in that photograph, and I was like, well, okay then, off we go. So.
But what you said, like kind of living beyond the facts, right? Like institutionalized witnessing, as you're sort of describing the purpose of this photograph, right, is often witnessing that's flattened into evidence, right? It becomes evidentiary knowledge rather than maybe you transform that evidence, that evidentiary knowledge, into maybe a more experiential knowledge.
Yes, as the whole experience of research in the archives was all about looking for evidence and trying to find things that I was permitted to use, and trying to find things that were more about the person rather than about the event or about the proceedings, the court proceedings, or whatever it was that I found. I was looking in bombing documents and things like that. Which, interestingly, it doesn't make it into the film. The most interesting bombing document I found was from the pension office, who, after every bombing in Bristol, there would be this flurry of documents by officers who were worried about the pensioners who were their clients, and knowing that they were going to have new clients because of the bombing that had just happened and people had been killed, heads of households or whatever. And that was the most poignant of all of the documents I saw in the archives on that subject. It's just a simple institutional thing about people, as opposed to, how powerful the bombs were and where they fell and things like that.
Yeah, as I kind of alluded to before, and I think that this kind of reifies that a bit, that that witnessing is kind of risky business, right? Like there's often something really at stake, especially when your kind of active experiencing is reduced to something that is just evidence, right? To be used institutionally, like in a court, for instance, you call a witness to the stand, right? Like, so there's other kind of like legal witnessing that we have that is quite risky. Like, but by being there, by having been there, you now bear this responsibility of witnessing these events, and they might be very terrifying, traumatic events that happen during wartime, or force you to leave a country. And that makes me think of your film Saif of Bazuna, and like it opens with this kind of act of witnessing this ritual, or a ritualistic slaughter of a lamb, right? And then they come up and step their feet. If you could explain what exactly that is, but it feels like it's a marking that they were there, right? Almost a form of proof of witnessing the event. And there's just something I think really compelling about that particular shot.
Yeah, so this is family footage actually, and this is all my family in that footage. It's ritual that Christians, we come from a minority of Assyrian Chaldean Christians, and also Muslims do it as well. So that was in that footage, that was our first, one of my two sisters' first communion. And the ritual is basically the blood of Jesus being spilled to protect us and to mark the occasion. But it's horrifying in a lot of ways, especially when you see children. If you see the film on Friday, you'll see, kids stepping in blood, and that blood represents kind of witnessing a death, but also everybody's happy and everybody's like, this is what we need to do, this is part of the tradition. And then to show it to Western audiences, this film has mostly been played in the US and Europe, and everybody is kind of surprised by it. Everybody's like shocked, like what is happening? And for us it's very normal. But then that's one of the things when I talk about items not to bring with you, I talk about, well, is it items that, on the periphery that not to bring with you when you immigrate, or also the traditions and the culture and the ideas and the memories. And there's a shot of me, a close-up of me, like this is all just the camera guy who was filming the communion. Very intense close-up on me, and I look horrified, stepping in the blood. And I was watching it, and it was, of course, my family just think it's very funny and cute, and I think it's funny and cute in a lot of ways. But to see my face as a child trying to understand almost what's happening, what's going to happen to me eventually, like there's some sort of a metaphorical, like futuristic look, like holy shit, this is going to be intense, or my life, or people like me, their lives going to be intense. And witnessing it as a child, and then watching it on like this 4x3 archival footage is almost as intense as stepping in that blood. It's like stepping in that blood again, almost, to watch it.
Yeah, I really like your idea of centering the periphery in the film. Like, I think it's just a very, because of course that seems like that's impossible, right? It's kind of an oxymoron. How can the periphery be in the center, right? But if we approach, right, the world in that way, I think it reveals things that you wouldn't see in the face of like the generalization of geopolitics, right? So it's kind of insisting on the specificity, right, rather than allowing geopolitical generalizations to define like an entire existence or an entire culture or entire migration of people. I was going to ask you about the objects, right, about the items, about the things, and whether or not you feel like they have a subjectivity themselves. Like, do they witness?
It's more about these things on the periphery becoming all of your life, like your hairbrush, your hat, but also your older sister, my older sister who still lives in Iraq. Everything becomes the periphery, like this, like the big things, like your sister, and then your blue hat with its edges torn. Both of these are almost become as important, because it's not about it's about leaving. So you leave everything kind of behind, and then things get lost, and memories get lost and they become fragmented. So and I always think of what happens to all these objects that I left behind when I left Iraq. What did they see? What did they witness? So kind of to your point, do these objects become I mean, they still exist, you know, like a watch or a piece of clothes. They still exist in the dust of war and the dust of being in a war zone. But it's still about human. It's still about the connection between the items and the human, and how they relate to the big idea of war, to the big idea of geopolitical conflicts, which would happen in Iraq.
Yeah, kind of this mapping of specific to the general,
Exactly.
rather than the inverse.
Mhm.
And I mean, maybe this is a good moment to move to Carolina and Rebel Objects, because Saif is talking about leaving. You're talking about coming back, right? And not, you know, watching Rebel Objects last night, there is a line in the film that very literally says the spheres are witnesses, right? That they are witness to something. So I wonder how you feel about that.
Yeah, I think the spheres are, of course, like witness of time and witness of looting also our story, no? Because they were found when the banana company was in the south of Costa Rica. So I think, yes, it's really interesting how also cinema experience make us be witness. And like for me, for the stones, it was important also to be an act of like see these stones like again with another gaze, you know, like giving them also this subjectivity to these objects that were like forgotten, no, and that we ignore, or we don't want to see them like with life, with story, you know. So yes, I think it's important. It was an important element. Yeah.
No, I think the film, for me at least, you know, because I've been thinking about these ideas quite a bit. So apologies if I'm imposing anything in terms of meaning. But you know, if documentary can operate in this social realm, right, and we can live in this realm of witness, right, as Forché would call it, like I have this idea, right, that social beings maybe are not limited to human beings, or maybe not even limited to living beings, right? But that the world of social is comprised of sets of relations that include objects, right? So in that sense, maybe objectivity is constituted by subjectivity rather than in opposition to it.
Yeah, and I think the social also becomes social because there is emotions that connect us, like humans, no? Because social can also be looked like something from a distant, not like the social. But I think when the social has power is when it touch us like with the emotions, no? And I think for me there is the social that can bring together the personal and the political when there is emotions, yeah, that can touch us.
Yeah, I mean, it is. You said it as a
Touch.
joke last night when you said, you know, oh, when people cry looking
Look
at
at stones.
at a stone, then you've done it. But I think that there is this affective, you know, very tactile, you know, invested in the embodiment of those spheres and your relationship with them, always providing like these senses of scale. You know, someone standing next to it in some way and relating the human to the sphere all the time, even when the human's not present in the frame. You're investigating its topography, its cracks and crannies, and there's a feeling to it. There's an affect to it. It doesn't feel like cold, empty stone. Like there's some kind of warmth there. And do you think that warmth comes from the fact that it was made by a human, probably, or is it there on its own terms, you know, as the sphere? Like, does it now have its own existence? Maybe in the same way that you were made in Costa Rica and you left, and then you come back and now you're different. And so that just because you were made in that way, the sphere was made in that way, doesn't mean that that's what it has to be forever, just something a human made, that it's its own being.
Yeah, but I think it's like film you can project also in these stones or in these objects, you know, and put the emotion that you want to put there, no? And also we wanted also like with the, they said like make the stones also like subjectivity, like how these spheres look the world. So with the photographer, we are also like playing with the frame, like to have the look from the stone also. Like to build this language, I think that it's important also to connect with the audience. Also that feeling of warmth that you say, maybe like there is a construction with the language, no, film, and with the sound, and I think it's all together, no, those all these elements that can create that experience. Yeah.
It did strike me that maybe the spheres are like, that sphere is a technology, right? Not necessarily the tool that was used to make it, right? But that the concept of sphere is more the technology than the tool that makes it. And that is leading me to think about Adrian's project, which is so grounded in kind of technology and its relationship to the political and how it affects us on a personal level, right? Like, so you're kind of going in the other direction, right? Like bringing this larger picture, maybe, you know, geopolitical or just political scale, and showing how it affects our psychology all the way down onto the individual level. Any reflections on that? You're coming.
This one? Yeah, I think one of the things I was interested in, and I kind of like start early in the film talking about this, is like all these sort of esoteric like quack science ideas that started around the end of the 19th century, of people talking about, I mean, I think Wilhelm Reich is probably like the most known one, these ideas of sort of electro, you know, magnetic waves affecting people. But obviously that sort of, there's like 5G, you know, conversation. I mean, literally someone blew up, like, you know, there was like a domestic terrorist attack on about 5G stuff, you know, a couple years ago. And then, but also there is this question of like, okay, how does that stuff affect us? And so I think that's like an interest of my film, in a way of like, we do have in our, it's not absurd to like make these connections between radios or something and transmissions and waves, and, or, you know, something like this spooky action at a distance, some way of connection between two people or two objects across the far reaches of the universe, and yeah, and see these parallels between like, well, we've also are making these objects that might be interacting in a certain way, or, you know, the phenomenon of you know, visual feedback systems. Like, it is kind of, there's kind of this, you know, sort of manifested, it's a man-made technological, or it's an objective sort of phenomenon that is living but not living, I guess. I don't really
Well, I mean, yeah,
where to go from there.
I mean, your piece is kind of an archive,
yeah,
right? And
yeah.
it's very committed to the archive. I mean, you're so caring even about those archival materials. The credits, you know, are so carefully and notated to make sure we know where everything's coming from, right? Like where you got it, what the context for it was, which shows like I think that there's something about each piece of archival material that we need to know that it has, again, maybe a kind of subjectivity, right? The archival material itself, it's not just like a dead thing, right? But it's like part of the social landscape that we're investigating, and you're bringing it together in your film as a new archive that has its own subjectivity that maybe is yours, but I don't know, maybe isn't.
Yeah, I think I wanted to sort of I mean, part of it was like almost a conceptual test to see like how many different types of archival materials, but also in a way of like,
I feel that.
yeah, I never counted, but it's definitely in the dozens of different like formats and stuff. And then also kind of like you know, stretch that at the same time. So sort of have like these sort of, you know, raw, whatever, like early 2000s or even 90s like JPEGs, and then also like, you know, looking at different like analog processing, video processing on stuff, and kind of this, yeah, it's like this sort of like perpetual search to kind of bring, I feel like maybe going back to the witness idea, it's like there's just a continual digging in a way of trying to like, you know, make these like sandcastles and stuff essentially, and it's like they're always going to get you know, torn down in a different way, like no matter what you do. Like if you go look at the archive purely as its own object, or do something like creative with it, like you're never going to like arrive at this point where like, oh, okay, this is sort of like, you know, a perfect relationship between the future that I'm projecting and my present activity and, you know, this archival object. So it's sort of about that failure in a way, or like the effort. Yeah.
Excited to see it in its entirety this afternoon. Speaking of technology, are oysters technology?
Depends who you ask. I think, you know, I think that like what you're describing of social systems as extended to objects, and I assume other living creatures, is something that I think about in just sociology, or like human relationships being sort of underneath the umbrella of like an ecological relationships, of like relationships between creatures and objects that exist in the world, and our little human problems are sort of caught within that, and are not separate from it. One of my producers really believes that oysters themselves have paid witness just because of how old they are. They're one of the oldest creatures we can sort of trace back, and the human interaction with them is also like very, very well documented through to like cave drawings. Like they've been around, and so there's sort of a perspective that you could argue about like the oysters themselves sort of paying witness, especially since they're this creature that really thrives not individually but in community. And so there's this almost like bee like hive mind understanding of like what they, as like a creature that has existed with itself for all of human life and beyond, that has sort of paid witness to the world. I don't know about technology. They have been used as a technology, the materials of them, and sort of like the ways that they have interacted with human culture, specifically, as I know about it, like New York culture, where they're like literally the building materials for some of our most iconic streets and churches and things like that. And now the sort of substrate of their own like regeneration as well. I mean, always their own regeneration, but now being sort of like intervened by humans in order to make that continue to happen. And I guess like that human intervention as being like a part of having witnessed previous human intervention leading to their demise and leading to sort of our demise. And so like having witnessed the ways in which we can drive a species to the ground without realizing that ecological umbrella, how do we consider the future and also sort of like consider ourselves in this moment's like witness to time passing, with this like forward thinking future mindedness, while we're sort of like something I am trying to sort of articulate and hearing what you all are saying also is like bringing back like the social is political and the sort of personal is political. When you don't make a personal film, it still is so, as we know as filmmakers, it still is so personal to us in how we're thinking about it and how we put our perspectives together on it. I think like we each are trying to sort of like create a perspective that we can share in the middle of change happening, like in the middle of crises. My partner says, we're no longer making films about catastrophe. We're starting to make films like within catastrophe. And so I think that is really changing like the idea of witness, is because we are, we're currently experiencing climate change every day. And, the degree to which we're experiencing that changes depending on where we are and who we are. But having the oysters as sort of this like constant, or having like ideas of creatures or structures outside of ourselves that will continue beyond us, have been here way before us, is I think helpful for understanding like how we as humans can pay witness to like great shifts and change that we can't really imagine yet.
Yeah, I can't help but see the parallels between your oysters and Carolina's spheres, right? Like the oysters are such stone-like entities from our perspective, but of course, from their perspective, they are probably much more fluid. And I mean, in many different ways, you describe them as queer, right? And oysters really they make me think of difference, right? Like a radical difference. And it's an idea that I kind of wanted to get to. I was talking to Saeed about this last night, right? Is Husserl and then Derrida's interpretation of Husserl. He has this idea of intersubjectivity, and intersubjectivity as opposed to this like scientific objectivity that we attempt to claim that the world can be seen from this like kind of God's eye view, from this third person perspective that that none of us need to inhabit, but of course we know exactly who inhabits it, right? Like it's a perspective that's generated in order to produce power, right? Usually over others, that God's eye view. And Donna Haraway has her idea of situated knowledges, of partial perspective actually being more powerful than impartial perspective, right? That it is our partiality, right? It is our difference, like that makes our perspective powerful. If it were universal, it would be nothing, right? It wouldn't actually mean anything at all. So Husserl and Derrida, in turn, intersubjectivity is an intersubjectivity that's not based on consensus, right? It's not like, oh, we all see this chair as red, therefore it's a red chair, and we all agree, and that's intersubjectivity. That's really just objectivity dressed up as intersubjectivity, right? But that a true intersubjectivity might be in the fact that I know that you exist because I cannot see from your perspective, because it is so radically different. And oysters, I think, really evoke this kind of radical difference that could be the foundation for maybe a more potent empathy, right? Rather than empathy grounded in sameness. And to me, that's also kind of a queer phenomenology, right? It's a queer kind of difference. And I wonder if you could speak to why you use that term relating to oysters.
Yeah. Well, great question. I mean, the very sort of like basis of a lot of my artistic choices in this film were really grounded in research. And so biologically, oysters are prodantic, or prodentric. No, prodantic. They generally change sex between male and female throughout their life, but often they'll switch sort of between them as is needed or as their desire is. And I think that like ability to change oneself biologically because of need, but also because of desire, because the only thing that an oyster ever decides in its whole life is what gender it's going to be or express at a specific moment. Gender's, a difficult term because they're not humans, but what sex it's going to be at a specific moment, and also where it lands. And the rest of its life, it really doesn't have like a brain the way that we consider a brain. So to be thinking about them as like a symbol for, sorry, I'm like hitting something, but to be thinking about them as champions of this idea is more, I think, about what we can take from them and what we can like associate with them as this creature that, again, like really depends on community for survival, has this like ability to change and this ability for difference. I think difference is a really interesting perspective because it's so often when we take our films like outside of the hallowed halls of an institution like this, you're met with like, well, what's the sort of like pro or anti, like like where does this land if you're going to pin it down to like a documentary point of view? And I think difference is very challenging for like all of us, for all humans to grapple with, but oysters are just such an anomaly. In some ways, there are other things that are similar to them, but I think that they're special, and because there's like this, there's no thinking behind them necessarily, and yet there is desire. It's really inspiring for like self-actualization and this connection between that like ecology that I'm talking about, like between the natural world and oneself. Like there's you get to split open the rock, you get to sort of like split open the symbolism and access, like either through like tasting or seeing it or smelling it or whatever, this like just pure life that comes from the sea, that comes from history, that that in its existence is sort of like letting us know that difference and life are like a part of like the very basic pulse of the earth.
Right, and it is an experiencing life, even if it's not a life with a mind as such, right? And I think that that's a common fallacy of Western philosophical traditions in particular, but I mean, the East doesn't completely get away with it either, right? Upanishads have their own problems when it comes to maybe centering the idea of thought or the mind or the self as the monad, right? As the thing that's irreducible. When, of course, we know our minds are composite, right? They are reducible, right? They're malleable, they're changeable, they're mutable, right? They're not always the same. When we leave and then return, we're not the same, right? So our mind is composite. Now, and not only can you remove aspects of it, but you can extend it, I think. And I think we use documentary a lot to extend that. But yeah, this idea that the cogito, right? Or even in idealism, like George Berkeley saying, the mind is the only thing that's real. Everything else is a product of the mind. It's like everything can be reduced to the mind. I'm not really sure that that's the case, because obviously an oyster is an experiencing body, right, that lives and moves through the world and has a subjectivity, but no mind as such, right? Or maybe its mind is not limited to its own interiority, but its mind exists in its community as like a social being that relies on other of its kind, right, to survive. So I think it's just a really fascinating exploration in that in your piece. I'm excited to see it as well. We're getting there. But I actually want to presuppose a little bit, Paul, and talk about Keats for a second, right? So Keats, right, the poet, he wrote this letter to his brother, right, where he describes this idea of negative capability, right? And what he means, he says, that is when we are capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. He phrases it in another way. It is, quote, remaining content with half knowledge, which I think mirrors partial perspective from Donna Haraway pretty well, right? That it is in not knowing some aspect of what we know that we find some kind of meaning, right? It's not in knowing the whole thing. And so he's explicitly referring to aesthetics in and of poetry. But I think that this space of half knowledge can be extended into documentary and into the social, right? And that we find that half knowledge, yeah, like I said, becomes partial perspective. It's the viewpoint from a specific subject in a specific place in a specific time, right? So not a flower, but this flower not a yellow, right? But this yellow. And Keats is talking about color. And so is Paul. And so I kind of wonder what you think about this idea of maybe remaining in this space of negative capability, in the space of half knowledge, in the space of not really knowing the full story, right, in order to get at something true, which I really like the quotes from Brakhage at the beginning of your film, Paul, and Frampton, I think kind of get at what Keats is getting at as well. Do you have some response to that? Sorry, I didn't phrase it as a question properly.
So Green Before Green starts with a Brakhage quote where from Metaphors on Vision, where he talks about this adventure of perception that we have prior to learning language and what rainbow of colors we can view before we learn to label something as color or as green in this case. And then another framing mechanism for the film is Hollis Frampton's work, Nostalgia, which kind of provides a structural counterbalance to Brakhage's uninhibited and free version of sight and vision. And so in terms of that component of the negative, or what we're unable to fathom, I think that's really something that frames itself in the sense that the footage that Atticus took from the ages of 18 to the ages of 4 is a vision that none of us can know, or that we can no longer access, right? Because we've learned language, we've learned how to frame the world through language and through these structures. And even he himself has reached a point now where he can no longer capture this world because he has acquired language, right? And so there's this idea of being able to capture that, and how do you capture that? How do you document it? How do you provide witness? Spoke with Nina Fonaroff at Experiments, and she was saying, well, Brakhage was trying to approximate that vision, and we were like, yeah, okay, yeah, right. And then she said, and Atticus is actually creating that vision. It's like, yeah, right. And so I think one thing that's happened with the technology is that someone who is 18 months old can take a camera, or the camera body, as you're stating it in the description, right, and to capture that form of vision. And now we have that as a document. Whereas I know when I was 18 months, the technology wasn't quite there yet. The ability to capture that wasn't quite there yet. So, I started making photographs when I was 8, but by then this idea of language has kind of shaped my view of the world, and in doing so, it shapes the documents and the frames and the witness, the action of witnessing itself. It frames those, and so to provide this counterbalance, I think, is something that is very important. The other thing that I would mention specifically with this screening now is that I've shown the film previously as just Atticus's footage. And so this is the first time that the film will be shown as its whole with his footage and my footage. And part of that process was saying, well, I was previously the only credited filmmaker, director when I showed his footage, right? And so to question that and to say he should really be credited as well. And so it was that moment where you're able to give or to prescribe credit to his vision and to honor that, even though maybe he might be unaware of the meaning of that, or even the relevance, or it may be, I'll tell you, be the most unimportant thing to him, right? But however, to have that in the documentation, to say this is a film by Atticus Echeverria and Paul Echeverria, I think is something that's extremely important. And then it gets back to what you said, is now you're you're defining a little more that negative space, or that counterpoint, I guess, which is a part of the film. And so that's something that I think is an important consideration when considering the polarity, or those two distinguished sides of the understanding, or the witness aspect of it.
Yeah, there's this. I think in that specificity, like of perspective, and the partiality of perspective, or however you want to phrase it, there's always loss of some kind. And I think a lot of these works deal with loss, right, in very direct and poignant ways. But loss is kind of the absence of wholeness, right? So rather than universalize, these ideas and try to say, oh, well, this is why you don't try to build utopian cities, right? Because, but instead of trying to apply that theoretical concept down onto the specific experience, we allow ourselves to live in a space that is incomplete, right? And you define nostalgia, literally etymologically in your piece. And I just wonder if you want to speak to the nostalgic element of it, because this is very future oriented. You've got a young kid who is now a filmmaker and making movies. You'd think that is like really grounded in a kind of a triumphant potential, but you really do focus maybe on a sense of loss, especially in the beginning, more than that potential. And I wonder how that came about, why that matters.
Sure. Well, in this case, it makes me think that the film itself would not exist without Atticus having a curiosity with the camera. It's something, and I'm speaking mobile device, right? I'm speaking cell phone video and stills. It's something that we didn't coach him in. It's something that we didn't instruct him in. He just started grabbing our devices, playing with the buttons, and creating an impression of the world, right? And so that's really the key impetus for this film is his curiosity. And then as he develops this archive, there wasn't a sense that we were going to do anything with it. But I arrived at a point where I was like, this really needs to receive some framing, and to transform this into a film. What other components are meaningful for this? And it was my early Polaroids that I said, oh, well, okay, this is his output. Here's my output. What if we put this together and structured it in a way where we're developing a conversation between the two? And then the third part of that is actually an unmade documentary, which is an aspirational documentary that my father and I had talked about, where he had created a march when he was an undergrad, and it failed miserably. And he essentially quit music at that. Well, he didn't quit music. He quit being a music major and pursuing a music career, and went into something a little more practical, I guess you could say. But in terms of that documentary, it's something that we were never able to make together. And so it's really three projects. If you look at it in that sense, it's two projects that you actually see on the screen, and then a third one that's still that's a theoretical, or in theory, a project in theory. But hopefully what it's doing is it's connecting these generations, if you will, and kind of highlighting the different technological approaches that we were able to use to either succeed or fail at being the witness.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to this idea after we talk to Devin, but this idea of the project that isn't in the project, right? The project that isn't in the film, right, I think is something probably everybody on this stage has something to say about. But Devin, I'm interested in your statement earlier, which is really about time. And I feel like maybe about, well, maybe not about, but you can speak to this, whether or not there's a loss of time that is kind of represented in this project. Is there a lament for the loss of that time? And also, can you lose something that's infinite, or that seems to be infinite, right? Which is, time, which seems to never end.
I don't think you can lose something that's infinite, but I think your relation and your understanding of it can greatly shift. And going to this notion of like the multiple projects, this is the third version of essentially a film I've been making since 2019. And so some of that footage has been reworked and reworked and reworked over again. And to me, it's not about the loss of time, but the shift in clarity around moments in time and how we choose to represent that. And this is perhaps the most stripped back and abstract version of this. And thus it's probably in some ways the least legible film of this tree of the three, because my first version I did was in 2019 as my senior thesis, and it was very all over the place. And then I redid it again in 2022, and I did this. But even as it gets more abstract, I think because my own understanding of that period of my life has become clearer, or at least allowing for fluidity that, like, I think, especially in my early 20s, there was a notion that's like life had to constantly go up in one direction, not the notion that can be unfolding and returning, and like going to the notion of the return. Like, it's the return's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just a way to reapproach from a different angle, a way to re-engage from a different angle. It's not necessarily a failure or a good thing. There's no morality around returning inherently. So to that, I don't feel it's a lament as much as it's a return and re-questioning and reprocessing and a chance to honor. I think the biggest thing about the project is I wanted to make a film that wasn't a definitive statement, because how can you make a definitive statement when something's still ongoing and still ever shifting? And so I wanted to make a film that was more of an observation and a witness, a document, and that allowed for that to be very porous in its nature. So I wasn't thinking about lamenting as much as I was trying to make something that gave breathing room to be like how I'll experience it today. It's very different than how I experienced it in 2022 when I made it and when I showed it in 2022. And I think I'm glad that the piece has that openness, because the last two pieces were very like, this happened and this happened, this is how I feel now. And like, even if they were abstract, there was like a closure to it. And it's like closure. A very dear friend of mine, the filmmaker Liz Roberts, who showed her incredible work midway last year, Mimesis, says closure is an illusion. And I mean, that could be very scary to say, but that's very relieving too. Because if you constantly search for closure, you can be such pain, but if you embrace that lack of closure, there's a sense of relief. I think that's what I feel Source to be, is a sense of relief and element.
Yeah, I think that's really nice. That this idea of returning not being necessarily so literal in a geographical, time space, but returning as a more conceptual idea, I think is really, really fascinating, especially because you're talking about relations, right? And the word relate means to bring back again, right? Its etymology is to bring back again, which is not just to bring back, right? But it says it had been already there, right? So when we relate to things to each other, they had already been together, right? We're just bringing them back again.
Yeah.
And it has this, I think at first it feels very grounded in the past, but when you say bring back again, you realize that has this futurity, I think, built into it, like potential for a future all the time. Like closure kind of wants to say, let's make this history, right? Let's relegate this to the past. Whereas maybe the absence of closure might be a more future oriented and maybe even a more hopeful perspective. Like you said, it might be relieving to not have to tie it all up in a bow really nicely. I don't know if you have any reaction to that.
Oh no, I think that's so true. I think it removes this pressure on this film to be this grand statement, this statement of identity. And like, I definitely think with earlier versions of this, I positioned myself in a way that was like, this is who I am. This is the statement I made. I was like very reductive in a way. And it's like, not that I regret that, but I don't think I would ever do that again. And I think this was a film that's like I can watch it, I could talk about what I want with it, but also I can be like, wait, let's talk about the music, let's talk about the abstraction. Let's like there's ways to re-engage with his work that goes beyond that initial nucleus. And I think that to me is a very more productive way to engage with these things. And I think the prior attempts, it was so identity focused and so heavy around that. And so like even the film was a little, the way of engaging was a little, it didn't allow for a return at all. So yeah.
Yeah, I do like the idea of thinking about our work, like the films that we make, the projects that we make, as having their own subjectivities that aren't necessarily tied to our own, right? That they do live in the world in some way.
For sure. And just one point to that, I was like, I knew why I initially had made this project, but the more I've watched it, it's become like something. I remember I had an internship in college with the filmmaker Ken Jacobs, and he was like looking at stuff he'd done in the 60s. Like, how do I do that in the 60s? I'm like, I never really understood what that meant, but I'm starting to get that where it's like the piece can live outside of you. And it's like, yes, I was interested in making a film about addiction and recovery and blah blah blah. But it's like I don't really know what the fucking film's about. It's like it's just it's an experience, and it's an experience I'm proud of. And it's like I don't want to over explain it. I enjoy listening and being in that experience. I'm excited to see what people feel. It's like it's something outside of me now, and that feels good to be in a relation to a work like that.
Yeah, I don't think that we have to explain ourselves, but we can still talk about it forever, right? So on that note, we could just go down the line here, because now I want to know what's the film that isn't in the film. You can go first, Devin. I mean, Paul already told us, but if you have a follow-up on that, go for it.
No. I guess like I said my thing. It was a very literal explanation of this period versus
I have to answer what?
Yeah, so we're talking about what's the project that isn't in the project.
Okay.
What's missing?
What's missing? Well, maybe I talked last night, no, maybe about more information, like archaeological information about the spheres that maybe people was expecting. No, of course, people always have their own films also in their minds, or when they are like following a project. So yes, maybe that part. Like, yeah.
I mean, I feel like what your father was doing between when you left and when you come back is not like there's that shot with three kind of triangular pieces of a piece of pottery, right? And it's like at this really nice moment when you realize that they fit together.
Yes.
But there's a gap in the center,
yeah,
which is kind of reflected in the structure of the story.
Of course.
Like I feel like that is it's not there.
Yeah.
But maybe it has to not be there.
This part of that of even the collective story, that there are parts that we don't have that information, no? And that we'll never have. So we have to live with those voids, no? And to learn to live with these voids sometimes in life.
Maybe it is those voids that actually produces meaning in the first place.
Yeah.
Right. It's that the information is incomplete that we can find meaning in it.
And that make us wanted to understand or to move to understand something. Yeah. About these voids, maybe also is the impulse. Maybe also. Yeah.
Adrian, how much archival material is left on your cutting room floor?
I'm sorry. I lost my voice. Yeah, there was a lot of stuff I didn't had to cut from it. I feel like the part that isn't there kind of has to do with like the ending, so I don't know, I can't really give it away. That's
no
me.
spoilers.
I know, yeah, I'm trying to like get people to show up, but yeah. Okay, I'll leave it as that.
Penny.
There's probably at least a couple of films that aren't in this film. One is all sorts of archival footage, archival research that I did that didn't make it in for really partly because the the images are not dynamic, and I just didn't want to go down that route because it would flatten the work. And the archival research, the archival footage I found an amazing piece of footage from 1942 of the bombing of Bristol, and it was 16 millimeter in color, shot by a pharmacist in some place like Buffalo, who was from Bristol and paid some person in Bristol just to walk around and film. It's remarkable. And I saw that and I thought, okay, well, that it speaks to something, but everything else it was just, I mean, I could have gone on and on and on because it's so dense, right? It's the Second World War. There's lots of archival footage, there's lots of archival documents, but I didn't want to do that. The second film would be about what happens, sort of the film ends with a lot of unanswered questions, and specifically about my mother, and I just leave it there. And so that is a whole other, it's called Before Me for a reason, because it's about this photograph and Before Me. So it just ends at a particular time before all the events happen that eventually lead to me. So I'm not interested in that, but it leads, as a result, a lot of things about her are left unsaid.
Well, I really am interested, Devin, in this idea of like a film that never stops, because when you're in the process for so long, it's like the process becomes your life in a way, and the way that it's changed, the pieces you lose. Like, I think another answer to the question you asked earlier about like why queerness, and I think it's about adaptability and like the need for adaptability. And yet here we all are like making this medium that like requires a beginning, a middle, and an end. Regardless of how we feel about the process of it, the product is usually very finite, and I think that's interesting. But the film that we didn't make was a much more critical piece. I think when we set out to make this film, I was really interested in like what makes optimists keep going, like what sort of like makes people move in the face of like these gargantuan threats, like move an inch, move like one little oyster at a time. And some of that is present in the film, but I think originally we were considering ourselves as filmmakers as like realists who were interested in optimists. And apparently that's not how it reads. So you'll have to tell me, but I did shoot a very damning oyster shucking competition that was hosted by the nonprofit that is like restoring oysters to the harbor. But something about, our perception of like gluttony and overconsumption and the history of that being paired with this organization that's sort of like trying to answer that like gap, this huge like billion number that they're trying to put this however many oysters in the water again. And so our film, I don't know, I think it has elements of realism and criticism, but the like grotesque shucking competition is on the cutting room floor.
I kind of want to see that.
For me, I think that what's missing in the film is kind of this relationship or this story about the cat and the kid, and the cat is kind of missing throughout the film. And the cat is just not really, is there, but it's not really there, and that makes the film kind of more, you focus more on what the kid goes through in relation to that cat that is around, but you don't really see it. So the cat is missing, I think, from my film.
I love that.
Well, these are all really interesting stories. For me, I guess the film that's missing from my film is actually in the film. So I set out to make like a 10-minute, maybe max love letter to these buildings. And then I kind of started talking to people who had been involved and resisting them and whatnot. And then I felt like I had completely lost control of the film, like it belonged to them suddenly. And it was like a good feeling. I mean, it was a good process, and I'm glad that I went through it. But it was just an interesting experience of being like, oh, right, this story, these buildings don't belong to me. They belong to other people. And I am like, I have some kind of responsibility to them. So yeah, I guess that the film that I originally wanted to make is somehow, I tried to embed it in what became a much more conventional film and story. So
That's interesting that the film that's missing is in the film.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Look for
which I think speaks to this idea of things being maybe constituted by absence more than presence, right? Like that maybe objects are constituted by subjectivity rather than, their matter or their individual materials. Like atoms are mostly space anyway, right? So those hard spheres, right, that are, that shatter or could crush you, or that have this like very kind of domineering at first. They feel very dominant. They feel so powerful, and then by the end of the film, they seem to be broken and shattered, and there's like, like I said, that warmth that they seem to exude even through the black and white, I think is really, really compelling to me. But what I want to know is, do y'all have any questions for each other? Because this is a conversation after all. And Emily kind of got us started talking to Devin. I don't know, Devin, if you have a response to what Emily said, but anyone can ask anybody a question. Then we're going to throw it to the audience. So.
I think even if our films end, because they're coming from us as our resource and we're ongoing with that, then the film never ends. Like, it's like, I feel like I've always made the same film since I was 18, but it's like, I'm just making a different version. It's like the same things that concern me. Like, I think the issue, we always have the same concerns, they just manifest in different ways. So the film is ongoing. And I think the act of returning shouldn't be seen as a bad thing. Like, I mean, there's examples of experimental cinema. I'm the Filipino filmmaker who like recuts his film every few years if someone can help. Someone knows who I'm talking. Basically, he would make one cut, show it at a festival, recut 3 years later. Emily Bayduke and Cooper Batsbury, who are in the Infernal Grove, which is a collective I'm in. Their project has been ongoing and constantly recutting and resweeting. I mean, Jonas Mekas is a great example of like, so I think we live, and going to the notion of queerness, it's like one of the queerest things we can do is saying that we have a right to return. We don't have to exist in this binary of it being over, because as you said, like, we're making work in crisis. Like, over is a lie. So like, we have every right to return, whether that's a literal return or a subjective return. And it's like, I think this also speaks larger to like issues of circulations of work and that notion, like, once you premiere it, you can't change it. And it's like, it's all very arbitrary things that get in the way of the actual work. So that would be my.
Should say that I taught an editing class last semester, and after the students had cut out of an archive, because I wanted them to be working within the archive, so we talked about archive a lot. After they cut their first film, and they, it's their first time cutting anything, they get all the way to the end of the process, and they haven't thought of a different way of doing it. It's not like they had 33 versions of it that then they came to the final one. They got to the end of the first assignment and they were ready for the second assignment. And I said, recut your film differently, like same material, but same archive. It has to be a different feeling. And it blew their mind.
Yeah, I mean, John Grierson, who coined the term documentary, right? Like, watched Flaherty's Moana and said, I need a new word for this. I will use documentary, right? And said it's documentary is the creative treatment of actuality, right? That's his definition. But in that same paragraph, which gets talked about a lot less frequently. In that same paragraph, in that little tiny article he writes, where he defines it as a creative treatment of actuality, he describes the documentary as an art form where you think the subject from the self, which I just think is like not what you expect John Grierson necessarily to say, you know. And it's in the same way that, like, in maybe Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology, is like you think space from the body, rather than say, oh, we're in space, like kind of floating here aimlessly, and you know the space exists whether we're here or not, and instead saying, no, the space exists because we are here, right? Like that's where it comes from. And in the same way that the subject of a documentary kind of exists because we are ourselves, right? Like we can kind of think the subject from the self rather than encounter it as in this kind of very Enlightenment era sense of discovery, right? Oh, let's discover the world. We're gonna run into something. We're gonna have this encounter and claim it as our discovery, but rather that discovery is from the self to begin with, and it's grounded in your very specific perspective. So I think there's something really compelling there, Devin, about what you're getting at. Paul, did you have a?
Yeah, I just, it's very inspirational to hear these thoughts. And what I would say is that as experimentalists, whether that's within documentary or you define yourself as a documentarian or an experimental filmmaker, I feel that that's a boundary that deserves to be shattered, is this idea that a film has to be prepared and you take it, from assembly to rough to fine cut, and then you release it. And that's the version that gets, put in the record and there's no revisiting it. But this running document where it is malleable and flexible. I know I've done 3 versions of my own film and probably more in the pipeline, right? But I think that that's an important component of experimentalism that's important to underscore. And it also, for whatever reason, just reminds me of Chris Marker's style, like a sans soleil, constantly just this pastiche of running images that are kind of flexible. And so, yeah, thank you for kind of inspiring those thoughts in the conversation. It just makes me feel more assertive with my revisions rather than guilty, right? Because there's this guilt to like, oh, let me get to the finish line and finished product. But this is saying, no, keep working it, keep developing it, and create the versions that are appropriate for what you're trying to say.
Yeah, that's really, really nice. And it made me think, Morgan, actually, it made me think of the hands, right, in your film, where you see the hands putting the documents in front of the camera, which you didn't have to do,
Right.
And you could have cut around that. And I think you described the piece as becoming more conventional. I think that's the word you used.
Than I had originally intended.
Yeah, but it is like, I guess, I don't think it really is.
Thank you.
Very conventional, right? But and it is gestures like that, right, where like we know you're looking at these documents, like you're having an experience with them. It's not just like this 30,000-foot view, like here's what happened and this is someone else's story and I'm just trying to do it justice, but it is your story as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that that's, partially one of the reasons I did that is because I had so many stills that I was dealing with. I was like, I have to make this a little bit more interesting, but also, trying to editorialize and think about like encountering different archival images and just imbuing my own like speculative meaning onto them, which is something I tried to do with the voiceover a bit more. But going back to this conversation about films not being finished, it reminds me of Octavio Gittino and Fernando Solanas' Third Cinema. So when they made Hour of the Furnaces, they're like, this film is just a pretext and we're going to, constantly be getting feedback and it's going to never end. It's going to like always change until like the revolution has happened, because it can't be a perfect film until like the world we want to see come into being has actually come. So it just reminds me of this kind of like endless and infinite idea of like the film as being a social process, I guess. Yeah.
I mean, documentary as a pretext, I think resonates with me quite strongly.
Mhm.
Like I often say, I wouldn't mind if there was no film in the camera. Right. I'm like out there with the camera because it changes the way that I experience the world just by holding it, right? Like this extension, this composite extension of a body, right? And whether you're using a camera or using a microphone or you're using an archive, like I said before, which I think is the same kind of extension that's happening, it's like almost a pretext for having an experience in a certain kind of a way, right? So it does matter that it is you, right?
Yes,
Looking at these
absolutely.
images, right?
Yeah.
It does matter that it's your voice and that it's not your interpretation, but your experience
Yeah.
with this material, even if you weren't in the room when it was shot, right? And in some ways, like I said, that vibration happens, or not being in the room maybe makes it all the more powerful.
It's an encounter, right? Yeah.
Folks out there in the audience, I wonder if you have any follow-ups, thoughts, questions, concerns, complaints to post to these lovely artists up here. I'll help run mics to folks. But yeah, Bentley.
It's nice to meet my roommate as well, Paul. I got us some shampoo we can use. So. I think, well, one thing I'm thinking about here is that we often reek of anthropocentrism, our inability to imagine things even beyond our own human experience and consciousness. And there's kind of a parallel for me with the very language we use in filmmaking. So much of filmmaking, even our conversation today, often falls to one language. In this case, it's English. I can give the example. I was talking with a friend, a filmmaker from Sudan. It's Arabic in that case, which is ignoring all the other languages in Sudan. This person came from one of the languages that had been systematically repressed over the course of years. Maybe a callback to Aramaic and the Chaldean and Assyrian communities and stuff in Iraq as well. And I asked this friend, I was like, how do we, as a filmmaker, because we're here with this energy to challenge all of these systems that exist, how do we counter that singularity of even the language we use? And he said something that was like strikingly simple, but it got me thinking. He was like, well, I don't even view my film as using a language I other than the visual. I have visual language, and I might add to that, sonic language. Does that resonate with anyone? Paul, I'm thinking about the fact that you mentioned that the footage you're using was pre-verbal language. Is there something maybe you could respond to in that?
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you speak, because now just hearing your thoughts, it makes me reflect on some of my what films I'm interested in, like as feature films or even narrative films, and I find that time and again, I become more interested in films that don't have a specific language, or that you don't need to rely on the language to understand it. And I think of it like Ozu films, right? Like I could watch an Ozu film even though I don't understand Japanese, and still it would resonate with me. Or there's a Lithuanian filmmaker, Surinas Bartas, who makes films that are basically devoid of specific language. So you kind of get this visual storytelling, if you will. So in terms of like, how do we deal with that? Yeah, I mean, I think that pre-language aspect was really what the fulcrum that kind of put this project into motion. And I definitely feel that watching the footage, there is language there, right? And it's slowly, either, I guess you could say it's slowly developing into fixed language, or it's slowly descending into fixed language, right? Because part of that statement is that this is a value, right? This is something to be cherished, that we have this sense of vision prior to acquiring structure. And so that would be, my recommendation, my interest moving forward is that when we're looking at these notions of pre-language or visual storytelling, that we're looking at it as something to be cherished, something that's rare, and something that's really in the negative, as we spoke about previously. It's something that's not understood, or not it's not completely laid out, right? And that's the value of it. And so that would be my response to that, is that this is something valuable and to be cherished.
I have a question after the question to everyone here, but I also think a lot about like media literacy and the idea of a filmic language, where, we can see certain types of like movements, certain types of cuts, certain types of utilization of the film as a language that is untranslatable, or maybe you can talk about it, but it's not the same thing as reading a book. And there is something additional to that I think is transcendent. And also with the context of like, I'm very interested in like Trinh T. Minh Ha's work and the idea of translation as an act of violence and as an act of impartial, like it will never quite be whole to translate something. But I'm curious for you all, especially those of you who like physically did the filming yourselves, like how you consider like the filmic language and how you infuse meaning into shots or moments that don't have English or don't have a spoken language. Or we can just all think about it. Yeah.
Maybe one like a kind of like outside tidbit is that so a big part of my film has to do kind of with my family on my dad's side, which is still mostly based in Honduras on the North Coast, and was like really involved in the banana industry basically, and in like the 50s, and I didn't grow up speaking Spanish, and so it wasn't until like in my 20s when I began to learn it more. And I have a friend there who went to like a really elite English school or American school that was set up by the for the students, or for the children of basically like the managers of the standard fruit managers. And that was actually the beginning of English schools or American schools in Honduras, at least. And so she did the subtitles for it. So I don't know. I thought that was like an interesting, as a subtitles in Spanish, because I just wouldn't have been able to like, convey it to the level of sort of like precision that I wanted. But I don't know. It's sort of like an Easter egg in a way, that there's sort of like within the fabric of communicating, there's this like encounter again with these systems of power and everything. And then I think that's very like clued into just especially the history of Honduras and other places that were affected by these enormous like banana companies and stuff, that really where it's like, if you're access to English speaking, like they never read it, they didn't read a single book in Spanish there, and you weren't allowed to speak Spanish, so that was kind of like denigrated. And then what that kind of does to national identity, or just like creativity, or like what someone who wants to be a writer, like what would that do to them? I don't know. So there's kind of this like overlap within there. Just I don't know if like, I don't think there's an answer, but it's like this complication that I kind of wanted to like encounter with it.
Emily, just to to comment on that, it is interesting that now that makes me think of, you said we're instructing editing and such, and we're developing or rolling out this filmic language. Is that it's this mutual process of appreciating structure and saying, oh yeah, I'm going to cut this sound to that sound because it just flows really, really well, right? But then stepping back and also saying, being critical of structure. And so I think, to be caught in that intermediate space is definitely something that provokes a lot of thought, a lot of interesting questions about structures, about language. And also, if we look at the future, as we were talking about it, we're progressing into this era where we're becoming even more structured, and the robots, if you will, the AIs are structuring it for us at an even more rapid pace, right? And so I think as we proceed more into this era, there's going to be more of a nostalgia or more of a yearning for the unstructured or structuralist aspects of art, of film, of life, and I think that's going to be something where we're going to really appreciate the idea of those days or those moments when we were unstructured to the extent that we are.
No, I was maybe thinking about also like the power questions, like to be careful with the pre-language or the pre-Columbian history or prehistoric, no? Like maybe it's also not pre-language, but another kind of language, and like to be careful also not to think about how these categories, or when they said like society that didn't have written languages were not historical societies, no, they were prehistoric. So also I think it's interesting to also question those pre realities, no? And I think also, yeah, cinema is like a language that for me, when I start with anthropology and written text, for me words weren't enough to explain or to say things. So with cinema is the only language that I found to explain other things in other ways. Yeah.
Yet cinema language itself is learned, and it's a culture as well that sort of relies on the work of others and that kind of thing too. So a lot to think about.
I'm just curious, with language being so related to power structures, is there another metaphor for cinematic creation that we could look to when discussing it? Whether that's elemental or musical or something, because seems like one of the problems is language itself becomes so is so heavy within its own context. I just don't know if I'm curious if anyone has thoughts on this.
I mean, I think like Carolina, you said yesterday something about like the film at some point being a puzzle. I had similar conversations with my team about like, we've been thinking about this as a puzzle, but it's a poem, and trying to sort of like push past yes, you have to have the puzzle because you're trying. I think part of the reason why I was talking to Devin about this yesterday, part of the reason why we're making documentary art and not just art, is that we want the relationship to the real, that mirror, to be legible in some way and to be able to be like pieced together and read by an audience. But I do think that like video, it's challenging to work with moving image, moving sound, and like adding language on top of it. It's many elements at every moment. You know, you say like every frame a picture sort of a thing. Like we have thousands of frames and thousands of moments of sound. And for me, like my work, more in terms of like a felt poem, and how do I use language as a part of that poem that is also interacting with those other elements. But I've also been thinking a lot, as inspired by the oyster, about like meditation and like how that, like the act of breathing and sort of the like time-based, like repetitive structure of that is like also sort of influencing the notion of like time-based medium. But yes, I've been thinking about my work as like a poem and language as an element of it. Do any of you have like a way that you consider your work like that?
Yeah, all great points.
I mean, yes, cinema is like a deeply inefficient art form in a lot of ways, right? Like thousands of still images that, you know, I mean, Penny's film is like, it's thousands of still images of a still image, right? You know, and I in college, my roommate was a photographer, and he would make fun of me for that all the time. He'd be like, "Look what I can do with one," you know. But to Emmett's point, I mean, well, maybe language, and also to Bentley's point, maybe language isn't really all that, right? Like I think it maybe gets a little bit too much credit sometimes for shaping thought and experience, right? Because language is kind of a way of processing experience, and to some extent, experience has to come first, right, before you can articulate it as language or as thought, right? Like thought and experience aren't the same thing either, right? Thought is something we do with experience, and so maybe language is over-indexed as a precondition, like this pre-thing, like as if language is preconditional to thought, which I'm not sure that's the case. Penny, were you gonna?
Well, I just want to come back to where we started with the notion of witness. And, you know, I've been making films for quite a while. The gray hair speaks to that. And for a long time, I've had many struggles with my location within the work. And particularly the use of voiceover. And so for 20 years, I didn't use any voiceover. And then not until last year when Expo filmed This Film Is My Memory, which was in Mimesis, that was the first time I'd used voiceover since 2003. And I'd used text, so there was still the subjective voice, and obviously that's language. But then I stripped that away, and it was just you know, a series of experimental films without language. And then now I'm in Before Me because of my relationship to the piece, myself as witness, those things, you know. Voiceover, it's like a festival of voiceover, man. It's like there's like I talk, I sing. Oh my God, it's ridiculous. And I did that deliberately because it was the only way I there's other ways I position myself within the work in terms of the use of a bowl axe, and an embodied camera is another way to do it. You know, my shoes show up. Are they my shoes? There's there's shoes in it anyway. And but it comes down to witness. It is a difficult thing to strip that all away and to remove yourself if there's no way of creating that context for the viewer, which is everything. So it becomes a different thing if you strip away all the language.
Wait, can I make a comment without asking a question? Or is
Absolutely.
It'd be really annoying.
Oh, you can say whatever you want to say.
I think when you were asking about language and different structures, and for me, I use music a lot as a structure and architecture. They're just two things that I'm very interested in personally. But you kind of hit a wall in the sense that film can only be abstract for a certain amount of time, and then eventually you just have to do the thing. You have to point a camera at something and film it, something real, for the most part, unless you're doing pure animation. But I think every film here there is something that the camera's pointing at, so you can't just try and accept the challenge of music, say, to completely abstractly represent something without say a written language. But I also think, at least for me, I don't know if it's true of everyone here, but by working in creative documentary, I accept that challenge, and that challenge is really central to the work. That on the one hand, I want to transcend language, but the film, like you said, still has to be legible. So I have to accept language. And that tension for me is really the most exciting part of the work, is that I move back and forth between them. And then you end up somewhere in the middle where it's the space between feeling and understanding. And I think there's also a legacy we're dealing with, that documentary from news, the idea that it has to inform. But nobody listens to a piece of music and says, I didn't get it. What explained the second movement to me? But you'd watch a documentary like this and say, but I didn't get it. Where did the spheres really come from? So there's an assumption that it's a delivery of information. But that's a legacy that I think we have to deal with and break and transgress.
Yeah. So when we live in maybe this third realm where it's complex and full of contradictions, and it's not clear where the ethical lines necessarily are, and it is in fact us navigating those ethical lines, right? Those gray areas, and how we navigate it, that becomes kind of the meat of the work that we're doing in some way. Like it's not an obstacle like to be avoided or something we have to overcome. It's something we actually have to live with and engage with meaningfully, and the work kind of comes out of that engagement with that complexity or potential contradictions. It really it's making me think again of Morgan's Brutal Utopias, because this the complexity of where the ethical line is, of when you can tell a story, who's allowed to tell this story or that story or the other, right? When it's all grounded in identity, right, as the primary organizing construct for human society. Like I think you run into a lot of walls, right? But then if you maybe pivot, and it's not so much about just identity, but also about experience, then you can navigate those spaces that you couldn't otherwise navigate, right? Because you can't deny that the experience is being had, right? You can deny that an identity is assumed, but you can't deny an experience in the same way, I feel like. Sorry, it's not a question either. No.
I mean, I think it's funny for me because I really love watching other people's personal documentaries, but I could never make one of my own. So, but then I insert myself in very obliquely and obviously imbue the whole film with myself because I made it. But I think that you said something about like a piece of your life being like taken by the film or something, I think, and I totally related to that. So yeah, it's really interesting where that line lies.
Well, and it's, we talked about the kind of risk that we take, when we become, bodies with cameras, when we go out into the world, and in order to have these experiences and to try things out, to experiment, to risk, right? But it also comes, I think, this idea of legibility that Emily and Saeed have touched on, like it also comes with responsibility, which is something that Morgan said earlier, that you have some responsibility now that you have borne witness. Yes, exactly. Right? Now you can't just bear witness.
Now you told me your story, and it belongs to you too. So.
And it's a fundamentally social act, right?
Yeah.
To bear witness, because we then have responsibility for each other in a way that we don't otherwise, which I think is like a really powerful thing about documentary, just as a form. Right? That it does come with this responsibility, which we, maybe don't realize we're taking on all the time. Just what responsibility that is. We have a sense of it, we're not. I don't think we're always completely sure. We are out of time, but we maybe could squeeze in one more question from the audience, if there is one. Louisa.
No, I just wanna. This made me think the idea of responsibility and taking care of each other and witnessing and but also interfering made me think of also community building and where does that come into this conversation where we witness, we get involved with the camera, and how do we take care of each other and support each other in the community. So maybe it's not the question, it's just
No,
a thought.
I think it is. I think this probably, I think a lot of people here will probably feel this, but I always feel like I get maybe too involved sometimes. Like you start going, I'm going to make a documentary about this. And then you realize that the documentary becomes like this nexus for a little community that builds even around the project. And the result of the project almost doesn't matter, right? Like putting it up on the screen at some festival, like later on, months, years later, when you finally edited it, sort of, doesn't really matter that much anymore, because what really was the project was this community that you build around making it in the first place. And that's kind of the artifact of documentary more than the documentary object itself. I don't know if anybody else feels that or has felt that in their work before.
Absolutely. Like in the film that I just made, I've lived in the Twin Cities for 20 years now and never had very many relationships with people within the East African community. And now I have very good friends who are in that community and I spend time with them on a regular basis. I'm doing projects with them, and the whole, there's a whole world that's kind of come out of the film, which is not anywhere in the film, but it's in my life now, right?
Thank you for your question. I also wanted to say, just as we lead and witness, I think it's particularly special to have personal films like yours and where you have experienced something so profoundly that you should share it, even if it's painful, even if it's difficult, even as you wrestle with these questions of how much of yourself to give. We appreciate it. And also, I mean, our film was born out of the idea of community. I say we and mine kind of interchangeably, because we made a feature, my friends and I, on this idea that we needed each other and needed that friendship and support in order to in a way launch our careers, but also sort of storytell with one another, that we were feeling subjected to the powers that be within the industry and weren't being given opportunity. So we gave the opportunity to each other to rise to the occasion, to have ideas together, to create partnerships with each other, and then also extended that type of community building ideology to the folks that we met. And the film itself, you can see those connections are really important to the understanding of what I'm trying to say and my legibility of how these elements fit together. But also, we did a lot of trade in kind stuff, and we collaborated with our subjects a lot, which I think is important, especially also as a white filmmaker, featuring subjects of color, especially trying to sort of use filmmaking as an inciting incident to create opportunities for collaboration, creation together, for telling new stories, not only from my perspective or our perspective, but be influenced by the subjects themselves more than just in paying witness, but in hearing what they think should happen with the film, and trying to sort of have those subjects meet each other and create opportunities where I'm building this whole resource of every person that's ever touched an oyster in New York City, and this person might want to know this person, and now there's this whole web of people that, because they've touched the film, they're connected to that web. And so I think that's the lasting impact, like even before anyone's seen it. No one's seen it yet, but that web has like already had an impact. And
maybe sometimes for good reason, a lot of the time we get very focused on exhibition as the way that our work has impact in the world. But I don't think it's the only way that it has impact, as Emily has just described. Any last thoughts on this? I feel like the next conversation in a next edition of Mimesis should be like documentary as mutual aid or something like that. Paul, Devin, Carolina, Adrian, Penny, Emily, Saif, Morgan, thank you all so much. It was a lovely conversation. And I can't wait to see all your work.